So what do you think of the remodel? Leave this up that way. I kind of like a theme, a Navy theme. No, really, it's for VBS. Look forward to having a bunch of kids here this week and the workers that are here to help them. And I know there's a couple of volunteers that have been voluntold to put up stuff on the stage. Right, Raymond? Absolutely. There you go. Can we get an amen from our brother? Exodus chapter 4. Exodus chapter 4. If you haven't signed up your kids yet for VBS, tomorrow morning. If you have, you're good to go. Exodus chapter 4. We're going to be in verse 18. I don't know why I took my glasses off. They got that problem fixed on them. I'm still used to doing that. So, you ever see CSI Miami and the guy with the glass thing? On, off, on, off, on, off, on, off. Remember what they got? That's how I felt for the longest time. And I said, just make me some bifocals. So, that's free, by the way. That's free. That's not in the text. I hadn't started reading. Sorry. Exodus chapter 4, verse 18. Moses went back to Jethro, his father-in-law, and said to him, "Please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see whether they are still alive." And Jethro said to Moses, "Go in peace." And the Lord said to Moses in Midian, "Go back to Egypt, for all the men who seek your life are dead." So Moses took his wife and his son, and he had them ride on a donkey, and they went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff of God in his hand. And the Lord said to Moses, "When you go back to Egypt, see to it that you do before Pharaoh all the miracles I have put in your power. But I will harden his heart, so that he will not let the people go. And then you shall say to Pharaoh, 'Thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn. And I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son.'" All right. First half, pretty straightforward. Second half, a lot of stuff. So we're going to take care of the straightforward stuff and then get into the deep stuff, and then we'll get to the stuff we really need to get to because this passage has a lot of implications. Moses comes down. Now remember where he's at. He's there with the burning bush, and the burning bush is at what mountain? I'll give you a hint. It's a mountain. Sinai or Horeb, or there's another name for it, the mountain of God is called at times. Same mountain. Don't get wrapped around the axle. It's kind of like my parents live in Mahia, or if you're from there, Maher. Same place. Florence, and by the way, there is no Florence in Italian. We call it Florence. They call it Firenze. How we get those from that, I have no clue. But so if you go to Italy and you go looking for Florence, you'll never find it. But it's Firenze. That's the town you want. And you've all heard my pizza story, so I won't bother you with that. It's that mountain. Same thing. You can make those changes. Moses comes down. He goes and he sees Jethro. And notice he says, "Jethro, the Lord is sending me to deliver the children of Israel out of Egypt." Right? No. Notice what he says. I find this kind of odd and kind of interesting because, I just find it kind of odd. "Please let me go back to my brothers in Egypt to see if they're still alive." Kind of perplexing. Now, is he talking about his natural physical brothers, of which we know of one who's coming to meet him, whose name is Aaron, who God has already said is on his way there? Or does he mean more than just basic family relationships to the nation as a whole? And we know that the nation as a whole is still alive. So he doesn't fully give Jethro a full answer, nor is he required to. And Jethro, seeing what's going on, gives him his permission. Why do you think he would have to give him his permission? Well, I have 2 daughters. And I know one day some ugly boy is going to come to the house and want to take them away after I've shot the first 2. Because boys are not very smart. They may eventually grow up to being smart, but not so much. Do you think it'd be a wise thing to ask a dad, "Hey, I'm about to take your daughter back to a place where I'm kind of wanted for murder"? Yeah, that right there is like a date killer, young men. Don't go up and say, "Hey, I'm wanted for crime in Dallas, so I was going to go to Fort Worth to a concert with your daughter? The answer would be no. It's kind of what Moses is doing, but Moses tells him he's going to go back, and Jethro says, yeah, go ahead. And notice God gives him a very interesting thing. So he's no longer on Mount Horeb. He's now with Jethro, and notice what God says. The Lord said in Midian, go back to Egypt, for all the men who seek your life are dead. Now there are some strange similarities between this and a New Testament guy. I'll let you go read and find those coincidences out. So Moses took his wife and his son, and they rode on a donkey and went back to the land of Egypt. And Moses took the staff that was in God's hand. So he goes. He's now on fire for God to go back. The Lord comes to him, because one of the things that you can imply from his excuses is he was afraid to go back because he was wanted for murder. And God looks at him and says, hey, the guys that are looking to kill you are dead. So the Pharaoh is dead, and the men of whose family you killed are dead. So it's safe, because it's been about 40 years. Moses is 80 years old at this point. So it's been 40 years while he's been in Midian. And so it's not necessarily safe for him to return, because do you think when one Pharaoh dies that the next one, especially his son, is not going to remember the decree of his father and who Moses is, or when he shows up on the scene they're not going to find this out? So he's not fully safe, but the Lord says, go back, you're safe. I've got you. And then we have this interesting interplay between Moses and the Lord. Moses takes the staff in his hand. That staff is very interesting because it can do what? It could be a snake. He's got a broke stick that's spineless, remember? When you go back to Egypt, see to it to do before Pharaoh all the miracles I have put within your power. Now initially when God gives Moses these signs, he gives them for Moses to prove to the Israelites that God has sent him. That you will lay your staff down, and it shall become a snake, to where the Israelites will listen to you and believe. And if they refuse to listen to that one, put your hand. Always a scary thing when a preacher goes to do this to me like this, because nothing in my hand. Nothing up my sleeve. One day, seriously, I'm going to put some powdered sugar in here and weird you people out. We will dismiss so early on that day, won't we? I should have done it today. That would have been awesome. Take your hand, put it in your cloak, and then it's white. Well, not in my case, it's natural. But all these were designed to show the Israelites that God is sent Moses. And remember the last one, he takes water from the Nile and he pours it out and it becomes blood. Now God has commanded him to perform those miracles for whom? Pharaoh. And many of the miracles that Moses will do initially, Pharaoh's wise men are going to be able to do. Moses throws his stick on the ground, it becomes spineless and becomes a snake. The other wise men throw their stick on the ground, they become snakes. But what was the unique thing about the sticks becoming snakes? I know I'm ruining it the surprise, but I'm figuring you'll be here anyway. The stick eats the other sticks. And so they're able to perform many of the same miracles that Moses is able to do. But I want you to do it for Pharaoh. But then now you've got this interesting phrase. For I put it in your power to do. But I will harden his heart so that he will not let the people go. Moses, I want you to go and do these things, but I am going to so shut the mind of Pharaoh that he is not going to listen. And we see here, because the minute when you start talking to this, I know there's some of you in this room going, but Pharaoh hardened his heart. Yes, I'm aware of those passages we have yet to get to yet. The text also says that God hardens Pharaoh's heart. But here, before any of that interplay happens, you have God saying what? I'm going to do it. And what ends up happens when you end up with passages like this, invariably you have this question that comes in to the argument of, if you have a sovereign God in all things, how is it that one then can act or make free decisions? As a matter of fact, we had this discussion in Sunday school this morning, and oddly enough, this was prepped long before the discussion in Sunday school this morning, if you were in our class. It was quite a raucous time. Much fun was had by all. And so you have this question that comes in, and typically we address this usually in a handful of ways. And typically the way Baptists address this, and we've covered this with Genesis 15, but if you weren't here for that, we'll briefly touch on it. We come at it from what is typically known in the more theological terms as a backwards causation approach. And it says, well, I've never heard that. You'll hear it in here in a second. God has looked forward in time. He sees what you will do. And then that gives him his knowledge. And this is where we get the backwards causation. My action determines God's knowledge. My action in the present determines God's action in the past. Backwards causation. And some of the problems of that view is, first of all, you've taken a non-temporal being, temporal meaning outside of time, no time, no, temporal time, outside of time, and then put him smack dab into time where he has to look forward. Well, first of all, that's a violation of who we know God is. That would be right on the edge of one of those things we call heresy. Secondly, it destroys his omniscience, because the way we understand omniscience and the way the text describes omniscience for God is that he knows in and of himself. It's not that he knows the possibilities of what we will do. He knows more than that. He knows not just simply the possibilities based upon what we will do, but he knows the path that we will choose. So how do you have that and yet be able to act freely? Well, I look forward in time and that gives God my knowledge. The problem is, though, what now determines God's knowledge? Me or him? Me. And you can go through this whole argument, and here's the sad thing about the backwards causation argument. It gains you nothing except two heresies. Because you are right back at the same problem. Because if God knows what you will do by looking forward in time, and since he cannot believe a lie, and he knows exactly what you will do at point A, when you get to point A, as a free being, you can't do anything other than what God knows before you did it, because he saw what you would do. So you're right back at the beginning. But now you've introduced two heresies in the nature of God. Walk on with that. I prefer not to do that. So then what we do is we jump to determinism. Woo-hoo! And typically, if you've heard anybody preach about Calvinism, they are telling you determinism. Which has nothing to do with Calvin. Matter of fact, I read Calvin on this passage, and you know what Calvin says? Well, we'll get there. We do determinism. Well, then God controls everything, and I have no ability to make a decision. Well, that's determinism. And while for some that's appealing, it eliminates, and you get into other problems of, well, then how can I be punished for decisions, and how can this happen, and how can I have an ability? It looks like I'm free to make decisions, yet God is in control of everything, and everything over here, God does it all. And it's neat. Put a bow on it. You can smile. But that doesn't solve the problem. Because then you run into other passages where here in a little bit we're going to see where Pharaoh actually makes an action and a decision to harden his own heart. And the determinist would go back and say, yeah, but God's already done it beforehand, so Pharaoh's action is just simply more an extension of what God has already pre-decreed, blah, 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 blah. The third option that we go to, and this is a relatively new one, it came out in the late 80s, and then it really became popular in seminary in the early 90s, early to late 90s, and then really gained ground in the 2000s. It's called open theism. And in open theism, simply it's what it means. God is open. Basically, God is like you and I. This morning, when we found out, and many of you are about ready to get some shocking news, and some of you already know it, 2 police officers in Louisiana have been shot by somebody. In open theism, God found out that exact same news when CNN broke it. God was in heaven. Dude, someone shot 2 cops. On 9/11, God was watching Comedy Central while playing video games. If you don't think it can happen, watch your kids. I've watched kids do it. I can't. I just don't possess that skill of multitask, if you want to call that multitasking. God was in heaven watching Comedy Central playing Call of Duty and looked over at the TV and whoa, someone knocked down 2 buildings. Jesus, you got to turn this to Fox News. That's not, well, why would you pray to a God like that? Because that's a God that's not very sovereign, is that not? That's not a God who knows the beginning from the end. That is not a God, as he describes himself in the beginning, in the Bible, as I am the Alpha and the Omega. I am both beginning and end instantaneously. Not, I am the beginning and I will eventually become the end by traveling through time with you enough. And so what happens is we look at this situation and we have what appears to fit in one of three categories. Either a gross contradiction or a contradiction in and of itself, a paradox, or a mystery. And what happens is typically we approach passages like this as contradictions, and so we have to add phraseology. And so what we do is to make sure we come out well, we go, well, we possess free will. And the problem with that is I really wish there was a verse that told you had that. The word free will is used 17 times in Scripture. All 17 times it's tied to offerings. And in the reference to offerings, it doesn't mean that you gave the offering out of a free volitional choice, but it was an offering that was not required and you gave it freely. Those are 17 times it occurs. So it's an implied task. And what happens with implied theology is always trumped by explicit theology. And here, many of the folks that would move into the determinist camp would say, see, this is explicit theology, and therefore it trumps implied. Because if I build theology strictly upon implied theology, Judas went out and hung himself, going, do likewise, it's okay to kill yourself. Samson did it. I can kill my firstborn because Jethro makes a vow to the Lord, and when I came back from battle, if my child comes out first, kill her. See, that would be implied theology. Those are two really bad instances of implied theology. So how do you fix this contradiction, what appears to be a contradiction, God being all-knowing, yet man having an ability to make a decision? Well, it's not really a contradiction because, well, I think more it's a mystery. It could be a paradox, and what a paradox simply means is that it appears contradictory, but yet there's not enough information for you to adequately decide which direction you must go. A mystery is something that you understand by faith that God alone has the capability to do, and yet you must accept it based upon faith. The Trinity. If anyone comes, I've had people do that. I can explain to you the doctrine of the Trinity. No, you can't. You can explain to me what the church has understood to be the doctrine of the Trinity, but the doctrine of the Trinity, when you start using analogy, breaks down into heresy. Either modalism, partialism, some other form of ism. You have to accept it, as Athanasius says, as a mystery revealed only through faith. And so what you have then when you come to this is we look at the text and we add things to our terminology that have implications beyond more simply than the terminology, because the word free implies morally free being. But you are not. Romans chapter 5 and 1 Corinthians chapter 5 both tell you that you are in bondage to that which is sinful. Now that doesn't negate that you have a will. I got up this morning and out of the 40 suits, sports coats, and slacks that I have at my fingertips, some of which do not fit me, some of which fit me better, and some of which I will never see that waist size again. I chose this. I do not believe that God in heaven was going, Ashley, choose the black pants with whatever sport coat color I'm sending you the visual image of, with the yellow shirt. Should I wear the boots or the comfy shoes? After consideration, the comfy shoes. I don't think that's what happened. I think I freely went to the closet, I grabbed the sport coat, which I like, and the shirt that I like, I picked these out, I dressed myself. Yes, I know. I adulted today. And the pants that I like. And amazingly, they match. I don't think I was forced to do any of that. I hear rumblings over there. I'm just going to ignore it. I don't think I was forced to do any of that. I do believe God foreordained me to own a Chevy for a little while. No, I'm kidding. I don't think when I bought my truck, there was this, no, pick the Chevy. I hate Chrysler. And Ford, I crushed them. I don't think that's what happens. So clearly there's opportunity where we possess the ability to make decisions. But how do you reconcile that with a God who knows everything? And on that, I must accept that on a mystery that I fully do not possess the capacity to fully know. But I am uncomfortable with attaching a moniker to something which implies something that's contradictory to Scripture, the concept of free. That comes after the word will. I have a will, and at times it acts freely. Pharaoh has a will, and at times he will harden his heart. Pharaoh has a will, and at times God is going to harden Pharaoh's heart. You will have opportunities to make decisions. Sometimes I look at your clothing choices and go, wouldn't have chose that. I'm just going to leave that right now. I'm just kidding. Some of you drive something with 4 wheels and a bed on it. You call it a truck. I don't think God forced you to do that. And there are other times where God is going to actively do things. And do things to Pharaoh here for a reason. And it's going to occur. Because if it doesn't occur, Genesis chapter 15 can't come true, and yet we find that it does. All prophecies in the text, if God doesn't actively make them come true, won't necessarily come true if we leave it simply up to human volition. How do you know that a prophecy of God comes true? Because God makes it come true. Not close to being true as with Nostradamus, but true to every point. You have that issue. And so, wait a second here. Why would God send Moses? Because this now begs the question. Why would God send Moses to do a task by which God has already told him, the task that you're going to do, Moses, is already determined that Pharaoh isn't going to listen to what you're going to do? Calvin, by the way, when he gets to this passage, he does not take the determinist view and goes, well, Moses is forced to do it. What Calvin approaches this passage with is this. What God is doing is he is going to demonstrate to Moses that even after he has called Moses and Moses has offered up his 5 excuses, for Moses to understand that his calling does not simply stop after 3 miracles. That there are going to be 10. And for him not to be discouraged at the fact that after he has told Pharaoh 3 times that Pharaoh has refused to let the children of Israel go. See, because Calvin, as well as you and I both know, people get discouraged very easily when God sends us on a mission. When God calls us into ministry, let me give you a huge, huge insider tip. Remember, you have heard it here first, and they can actually, pull my ministry credentials for this if I tell you this. Is that camera off? Once you become a minister, life doesn't get intrinsically better. And once you become a ministry, it's not clear sailing. And people listen to everything you say. Something moved over here, which really weirds me out because these things are supposed to be dead. I'm going to go back. Life doesn't get better. As a matter of fact, when you get into a ministry, you can expect life to get intrinsically more difficult. If you want a religion where life gets easy, Joel Osteen in Houston, he has a great package, great teeth and a hair. He teaches an easy believism. Go listen to him. The fact of the matter is God is going to use Pharaoh as a huge object. Oh, and look, it fell. As a huge object lesson. Coral is still alive, even on the stage. As a huge object lesson to demonstrate to the world his power and his sovereignty over a man who claims that he himself is a deity. And Moses, you're going to go and perform these tasks, and I have already hardened his heart that he's not going to listen. And I don't want you to get discouraged in what you're doing because, it's so easy that when you don't want to go and do the will of the Lord, when you run into a little bit of opposition, you go, well, guess that wasn't the ministry I was called for. I've seen lots of people walk the aisle to be ministers in the gospel. They're now doing other things. And the argument was, well, things got difficult. I don't like the bad stuff that comes with being a minister. My chaplain say, I didn't really join the army to bury people. I don't know what you joined the army for in the time of war. What do you expect you're going to do as a chaplain? There are ugly sides to every job. Moses, don't get discouraged because I have hardened Pharaoh's heart, because what I want to do is demonstrate not just my sovereignty, just for the sake of sovereignty, but I want to establish my name in such a way that 400 years later, when the ark of the Lord comes into the camp of the Israelites and the Philistines hear it, they shake in terror. To where when I say to you in the minor prophets and in the major prophets, 700-800 years after the Exodus event and even longer, I am the Lord your God who brought you up out of Egypt, and it triggers in the mind the absolute destruction that God brought upon the Egyptian people. Moses, you have a ministry I've called you to. You are going to go do this, but I want you to understand Pharaoh is not going to listen to you, not because you are a failed minister, not because you are doing a failed task, but because I have a purpose for the destruction of Pharaoh and his house. And you are going to go anyway. And a lot of times we come to opposition like that and go, well, it's just so hard. Name me a job in life that doesn't, you wake up that isn't so hard some days. I know of none. Every job looks easy to everyone else. That's why I usually love it when people look at me and go, you know how it is, I'm busy. Yeah, I know what it's like to be busy. I may have varying degrees of busyness that you may have, but we all have busy jobs that require busyness of us. Some of us less so, some of us more so. Moses, I have a task. And it's going to look like you're a failure on the first part of the task. And after the first plague, it's going to look like a failure because it looks like he's going to let you go and then, And after the second plague, it looks like he's going to let you go and no. But we kind of see the end outcome of what's going to occur here. Who knew 2 sentences had so much in there? Thus you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my firstborn son. Israel is not an actual lineage child of God as what happens in the Immaculate Conception when the Spirit of the Lord comes down and is conceived inside of Mary's womb and you have the virgin birth. This is not the language of childbirth. This is the language of pride of place. Israel possesses the location of firstborn heir. They have all the rights. They have all the privileges. They have all the understanding. They possess that of a firstborn heir as far as relationship and authority to me. Now, this would be an interesting thing when you're talking to a human God who believes that all the peoples on the earth somehow come from that human God, which I don't really understand how they believe that except for extreme narcissism and insanity. But rock on, that's how they rolled. Israel is my firstborn. You're going to see this nice little interplay. It's a nice little interplay within the text. They are my firstborn. You shall let them go. Let my son go that he may serve me. If you refuse to let him go, behold, I will kill your firstborn son. Now, if you have the ESV and the King James, the word there, if, is present. If you have a New American Standard, if you have an NIV, if you have a New Living Translation, if you have the Holman Christian Standard, and a few others, it will say this. Israel is a firstborn son, and I say to you, let my son go, that he may serve me. But you have refused to let him go, and I will kill your firstborn son. And this gets down to what we have within the text and the verbiage that is there, and the prefix that comes to that word. And a lot of times when translators come to this prefix, it can be translated if and. However, in many, many, many other cases, the majority, when this particular prefix is there, it's but, since, and then. And the NASB, the NIV, the NLT has actually translated correctly because that's how the Jews also translated as well. But I will kill your firstborn son. And those two verbs that are utilized in the kill are causal and conditional and connected. Because you have held my son and will not let him go, I will kill your firstborn son. At this point in the game, God has already declared his end game. And he has declared his end game and told Moses to go and tell Pharaoh. Because we know, just a few more chapters over, that that's exactly what happens. And all the praying and crying in the world will not keep that from happening. You tell Pharaoh that in the 400 years that I said Israel is going to wander, be slaves, be oppressed, that if he lets them go, when he lets them go, because he has not let them go, I am taking the life of his firstborn son. It kind of changes how you look at God now, doesn't it? It kind of changes how we take God for granted, does it not? See, we like the if, because it sounds kind of conditional. If I do this, then God doesn't do that. When you switch it and it's not conditional any longer, because you've done these things, my wrath is your son is dead. When we approach the things of God and we approach them carelessly or callously, or we ignore them as Pharaoh is going to do, whether by his own volitional will or whether or not God changes his heart, the end result is still the same. See, we have developed a very casualness with God in our relationship with him, because what happens is we take this logical error and weave it into our thinking. Since I'm a Christian, and being a Christian means that I can behave however I want, and God can't do anything to me. And while yes, as a Christian, if you believe in Jesus Christ, your eternal security is absolutely secure. However, a mind that makes that statement reflects whether or not you may not truly be a Christian, because you are imposing a lot of ifs. Well, I can then assume upon a holy God who tells me to live a holy standard that I don't have to, and I can still get in. And I can point to some parables that point to that. Well, then I can live however I want and do whatever I want, just as long as I believe in God, and I can still get in. And Paul addresses that at times as easy believism. And says that some of those folks are not in. There are a lot of times we come and we look at different denominations and we make proclamations about whether or not they are in the people of God because, well, they don't do what we think we ought to do. Here's a little clue. Not every Catholic's going to hell. Not every Baptist is going to heaven. Not every Lutheran is going to make it in. Not every Methodist is going to make it out. Not every Presby is going to make it in. I guarantee you there are churches all over across America that come the day after the rapture could have high attendance Sunday and never blink. Pharaoh believes that because he's a god, he can escape the wrath of God. Pharaoh believes that what he is going to do by ignoring what God or what Moses asked him to do, he can escape the wrath of God. And at the end of all these plagues, as God hardens his heart, and he hardens his heart, and all these things are performed, when God absolutely destroys Egypt, because he does, spiritually, economically, and physically. He decimates them in all three categories. The action that God does to Pharaoh, that he's prescribing and predicting to Moses here, or actually not predicting, proclaiming, has such a lasting effect that 4, 5, 6, 8, 9 to today has a lasting testimony. We debate on which Pharaoh it is, but we don't debate on what God has done to Egypt. We debate about which timeline it is, but we don't debate about what God did to Pharaoh. We debate about the timelines, whether or not the story is actually, but you cannot escape the validity of what God brings to be from this proclamation to Moses before it actually occurs. You go tell Pharaoh, Israel is my child. You have abused my child. And for that, I will take your son. And that should terrify Pharaoh. And yet it doesn't. And that should terrify us. And yet you're trying to figure out how to argue against that. That should terrify you to the core, and yet you will live in a lifestyle that may not be becoming of the Lord. That should terrify every believer, that it's not simply just saying, well, I've accepted Jesus, but yet I can live however I want. There's a holy God, and he possesses a holy standard. Pharaoh is not meeting that standard, and Pharaoh is going to suffer the consequences of that standard. You are here, and you may not know who Jesus is. Do not care. This is an opiate for the people. You've come because your friend is here. Let me tell you, friend, there is a holy God. And he has sent his son to die for your sins. And he has a holy standard. And one day you will stand before him. And when he brings out the decree of your life, judgment comes. Do you stand before him as a believer washed in the blood of the Lamb, or do you stand before him as a person that has thumbed your nose at him at every moment? The end result for Pharaoh is judgment and punishment. The end result for that is judgment and punishment. You're here today and you say, I feel God calling me into some type of ministry. It's not necessarily vocational. One of the takeaways from this passage is simply this. Sometimes your ministry is going to be difficult. Sometimes you're going to deal with obstinate individuals. Sometimes you're going to deal with a person that God has hardened the heart so that he can make an example of that individual for greater glorification for himself. At no point does that give you license to give up, nor to say, man, it's too hard. He doesn't say, Moses, you're going to run into a guy whose heart I've hardened, but that's okay. You can quit at any time you want. The caveat's not in the text. As the praise band comes to sing, as you wrestle with some of these issues, as you deal with them within your own personal, take an opportunity as they sing to focus in on what exactly it is God has for you. I will have my microphone turned off. I'll be here at the front for those of you who wish to come and talk to me. If you'll please stand.
If you open your hymnals to hymn 411, we're going to sing "'Tis So Sweet."